Yeah, sorry. Hey, everybody. It sounds like there were audio issues. So, hey, Quinton Klabon, IRG Senior Research Director in Education. Um, Basically, going to give you a quick rundown of how the pandemic money was spent. Those are the top five takeaways, and we'll leave time for questions at the end of 30 minutes of presentation. Thanks. First round was to get students back to virtual learning in ESSER 1. The second round of funding was to get kids back in school. Wisconsin got 686 million, and the third round of funding was for recovery for students after the damage from pandemic closures. So over 2 years, schools had $1.49 billion in Wisconsin. Public schools had $1.49 billion in Wisconsin to address student needs. There was a lot of flexibility on how schools could use that money. These are the top five takeaways. The one that we'll spend the most time on is this may surprise you. You hear a lot about shortages, you hear a lot about stress and turnover, but districts really did go on hiring sprees using that money, hiring permanent positions with temporary money. And now that is something that a lot of districts cannot afford. The second was that districts did not allocate funding fast enough. So we tracked funding every couple of months over the course of this time, making sure that districts were pushing out and being transparent about the money. Some did, some didn't. Third one, some districts, money was supposed to be distributed based on poverty. Some districts did not receive as much as they probably would have been fair. Some districts made poor decisions. We'll focus on one district in particular. And then lastly, unfortunately, the entire point was to help students catch up, and we really didn't in Wisconsin. Wisconsin had average recovery. So this is not a as much as I would like to say a Quinton Klabon original observation. It's really not the case. This is something that national people are talking about. Whether it's conservative leaning think tanks, whether that's progressive leaning think tanks, whether it's straight news, whether it's education focus, everybody knows that achievement has fallen, staffing has gone up, and students are disappearing. And when you have fewer students but a lot more staff, you end up with big revenue problems. So this is genuinely true. So this is over the course of the 5 years. So this is in the United States, 200,000 staff got hired over the extra staff or additional staff got hired over the pandemic period versus 2020. We lost 1,300,000 students. In Wisconsin, it was plus 2,000 and about 47,000 students lost. You're like, okay, couple thousand, 47,000, what could that possibly mean? If you're assuming $50,000 per staff member, that's $100 million. If you're assuming 47,000 students at $18,000 a pupil, that's $850 million in revenue loss. So essentially, there is now a $1 billion gap was created from additional expenses and lost revenue. We have about the same amount of students that we did in 1992. In that time, we had 7,800 fewer teachers and 20,000 fewer other staff. A lot of these are not necessarily administrators. They're paraprofessionals, teaching assistants, essentially. They're people who work in the building. They're people who do like mental health care and nursing and things like that. It's probably a good thing, there's more standardized testing now. We are identifying special needs better. It's probably not a surprise that we have more staff, but that amount of growth it seems to be unsustainable. And this is not something that's new just from the pandemic. It just got sped up by it. After Act 10, Wisconsin actually added teachers and staff, which I think is counterintuitive to what a lot of people think, whereas we lost about 16,500 students. So this is 15 years now, essentially, of adding more staff and losing students. And it seems like we're just at a breaking point where we'll have to make some tough decisions or pay up for it. Yes, so here is some tracking of what we're looking at. 41% of the dollars were budgeted for ongoing costs of compensation. That's about 613 million. And then a lot of that was going to teachers, whether that's over the summer, whether that's over the school year. But if you have temporary money and you've had, let's say, $300 million a year in ongoing expenses that you're not annually that you're paying for, that puts you in a really difficult position. I think a lot of times the blame is put on the revenue side of things. The two graphs at the bottom, you don't need to see the exact numbers, just the lines. The first one is the revenue coming from the state. And obviously, different districts get different amounts from the state, but overall, state funding has caught up to where we were post Act 10, at or near, and then funding overall certainly has. That's the graph on the right. So if it's not a state issue, we essentially have three options for districts. Either districts have to lay off staff since too few are retiring. The attrition is not happening fast enough. You raise taxes by referendum, basically forever, without seeing necessarily the results for it. Or you're like, hey, we have this amount of money and we want to keep this amount of staff. That means that you're not going to be able to pay people what they're worth. That's going to create turnover. That's going to create unhappiness. And sometimes when things are out of your control, like healthcare costs skyrocketing, you're just left with only the two options mentioned previously. Yeah, just some districts: Eau Claire, Wauwatosa, Sun Prairie, Oshkosh. Some key quotes that are worth reading. From this. Eau Claire lost about 1,000 students over the course of the pandemic, but they added 200 employees. And so, direct quote from, I believe it was their chief financial officer: enrollment has gone down while staffing has increased. That has been purposeful. And at the same time, that's a conversation we need to have. Wauwatosa, direct quotation from the superintendent: they called their model the most expensive model, essentially just having a lot of staff. If that's what people are asking for, that's what they're paying for. Sun Prairie actually had like an interesting discussion about the issue. The Sun Prairie district staff talked about how many students that they had, or how many staff they had per student. And the staff were bragging that they had within Dane County the close to the most amount of staff per student in the county. And then one of the board members spoke up, and I'll just again read a quick quotation. It looked like in 2020, our all staff ratio was 6.9, and it's been dropping steadily over time. If we're adding FTE every year, it's going to make it harder and harder to pay our staff the wages they deserve if we're trying to both decrease ratios and increase salary. It feels we're setting ourselves on an unsustainable track, and it's going to be painful when we hit the cliff that we can't afford anymore. And then the Sun Prairie staff said, we could pay people more if we didn't have so many people on payroll, but then it also makes people feel less supported. It's definitely a give and take. And then Oshkosh has had similar discussions just this week. And so again, you're seeing people in these pinch. Obviously, we want to get kids the resources they need. Sometimes they're legally entitled to those services, but something has to give, whether it's money or staff. So the second kind of big takeaway from this is that allocation really got out from some districts pretty slowly. So in the first 6 months, when we first checked in and did our first report at IRG, only 34% of the money had been allocated. That doesn't mean they spent the money. That means they had told the Department of Public Instruction what they were going to spend it on and how much they were going to spend. Basically, think of it like getting approval from your boss for an expense. After our report came out, we were really pleased to see, perhaps from the added spotlight and attention, that it almost doubled. It went up to 63% just a couple of months later. That meant that parents and staff and community members and policymakers and taxpayers could understand what was going on with 2/3 of the funds communicated. Unfortunately, we see after that it really slowed down. Sometimes that's because districts were holding to see what kind of final expenses would be, but some of them just weren't turning in their paperwork. Some of the districts that I want to highlight as having done a great job: Stevens Point, Ashland, and Marinette. They publicly communicated close to 100% of their funding as quickly as they could. Meanwhile, Port Washington, Ripon, Washington Caldwell, and then a couple of independent charter schools didn't turn anything until the last minute. So for basically a year and a half, no one, unless you were, listening to board meetings, emailing directly to the district, they had not publicly communicated where their funding was going. Unfair funding. Districts basically got funding based on Title I funding. So essentially, every school district communicates how many economically disadvantaged students they have, and to communicate that to the federal government. One of the few ways that the federal government supports school funding is through Title I. So based on that formula, districts got a certain amount of money from the ESSER III aid. The first, I basically wanted to compare two districts. There's Washington Island Northeast that got $5,275 per student. It's a very small district, got a lot of funding. 31% of the students they're economically disadvantaged. Obviously, those students were affected by the pandemic, and obviously they deserve funding. But there are some districts that have a ton of poverty and a ton of need. Arcadia, lots of English learners, lots of economically disadvantaged students that got $691 per student. And so essentially that allowed a lot of flexibility for Washington Island, and it created a lot of restriction for Arcadia. And you see that across the state. Ideally, it would have been, based on the actual poverty amounts frozen in time, but instead, some districts were not treated fairly because they didn't sign up enough kids for the federal program. And so I think, unfortunately, we'll see that in the results in terms of the recovery. They did some good stuff with it, bought some curriculum, that sort of thing, but you don't see the recovery that you would hope for. Milwaukee Public Schools. I'm a resident of Milwaukee. Really care about the kids getting a great education there. There's a superintendent there who's being really bold and focusing on the right things, turning around. But there was a previous superintendent you may have heard of who was guiding a lot of these decisions about how the money was funded back during the post-pandemic years. So there were some key things that a lot of community members or even school board members criticized and really desired for their schools that were not met. And they would have been perfect opportunities for this one-time funding. So in September and in May, when school can get really hot, it's really difficult for students to learn if there's no temperature control. Only 26% of classrooms in Milwaukee Public Schools are air conditioned. That would have been a great chance to install some HVAC or some fans or some kind of temporary relief, even if it would have been expensive. Milwaukee Public Schools was the largest recipient by far of ESSER funds. If you're thinking about the amount of students there and the amount of impoverished students, they just received a massive chunk of money. That would have been a great way to do it. They spent $0 on that. Secondly, it became a national story that Milwaukee, unfortunately, some Milwaukee students had lead paint poisoning. Basically, the paint had kind of corroded and they got lead poisoning. Repainting to protect against that or to remediate that could have been a great one-time option if they would have known about it. $0. They did send dollars to schools, basically kind of gave like a grab bag, $100,000 per building to address, whatever needs the principal and kind of the staff there needed without it having to be centralized. Not a bad idea, except that adds up pretty quickly to millions and millions of dollars. And Milwaukee Public Schools has a lot of under-enrolled buildings. And so $100,000 a piece are being spent in buildings that may be closed permanently this time next year. And that probably wasn't the best use of one-time funds. And lastly, as every district knows, unfortunately, Milwaukee Public Schools was late with its audits, and that created a finance crisis both for Milwaukee and across the state. Basically, Milwaukee is a large chunk of the students and receives a lot of state aid. So if their numbers are wrong, it affects the money that districts everywhere are getting. And there was a crisis that led to lots of districts being deprived of funds that were rightfully theirs, and they need to be paid back this past school year. One of the key findings from a state audit that was done of Milwaukee Public Schools basically said, hey, if you would have had the proper software that corresponds with the Department of Public Instruction software, and if you would have had just throw some accounting bodies at it to help solve the problem and get you caught up, that would have been a really effective way to make sure that you didn't miss these deadlines. That would have been the perfect use of one-time funds. And again, $0 spent toward that. And then lastly, and perhaps the most importantly, academic stagnation. Like if every single person was nitpicking, but we saw lots of growth for students and recovery back to top 10 status in the country, or a B rating in terms of the amount of recovery that students had. It's tough to criticize if the numbers say that students are doing well. Unfortunately, we know that students still to this day are not doing well as they were doing in 2020, or even well compared to other states. So a lot of people don't know that the Department of Public Instruction lowered the standards, lowered the benchmarks for state testing on the ACT and the Forward exam in 2024. That means basically it's easier to get a proficient score. They argued it was more accurate. Others argued it should be aligned to state tests. After a lot of criticism, DPI actually back calculated to the best of their ability what students would score under those old, more difficult standards so that you could compare year to year rather than basically having to start from scratch in 2024. So according to DPI, students in 2024 were behind about 3% in proficiency in reading and mathematics. and they were 3% more students scored in the lowest level, even 4%, close to 4% for math, scored in the lowest level, now called developing, I believe, in mathematics and reading. That is, thousands of students behind. And then Harvard University did a study where they showed they basically were able to compare state to state to say, hey, which states recovered more quickly than others, and what can we deduce about their policies, about the staff that they had, about solutions to getting kids back on track, to make sure that we are where we on the trajectory that we were in 2019 or 2014. So unfortunately, while mathematics was merely average, 16th in mathematics recovery, Wisconsin was 30th in reading, below average. We know that Acts 20 and other initiatives are doing their best to catch students up, but we know that unfortunately that Wisconsin is further behind compared to the rest of America than we were when the pandemic hit. Yeah, and then these are kind of the biggest conclusions. If this was kind of a temporary way station, if a lot of students left public schools in 2020 but found their way back in 2025, or if we knew that more students were coming to solve the revenue problem, maybe it wouldn't be the biggest deal. Like we could kind of keep the whole things together until more students came to provide the revenue necessary to keep these additional staffing models. Unfortunately, that's just not the case. We see on the left side that Wisconsin's predicted to lose 10,000 public school students every year for the foreseeable future, 100,000 students, 1/8 of the student population in 10 years, which is still insane to say, but the problems are only going to get more difficult when it comes to using funding wisely. And then secondly, we know that students didn't recover. I think a lot of people think that Wisconsin is a top 10 state in education. We have been before. But when you adjust for poverty, which nonpartisan nonprofit groups have done, you see Wisconsin scores basically average. The screenshot on the right is where Wisconsin ranks in fourth grade reading scores. We know that students need to learn to read by third grade and need to be testing well at fourth grade. If they don't read well by then, they're probably never going to read well, and it's really difficult to help them get there. And so Wisconsin ranks 34th in fourth grade reading nationally once you control for demographics. That's a tragedy. That's something a lot of people are working on, but it's something that would have been a lot more optimistic before the pandemic, and if we would have used the ESSER dollars in perhaps a wiser way. So what are some kind of consequences of all of this? We'll start with recovery. There's a huge focus on the science of reading. This means a lot of things, but it means focusing on phonics, getting parents involved, and holding schools accountable to make sure that students can read by those early grades. That's something that a lot of people are passionate on all sides of the aisle, and from parents to policymakers. And I'm hopeful that a lot of the work that's being done right now from hardworking staff across Wisconsin will provide kids the growth that they need. There should be an increased focus on teacher quality, quantity, and quality of life. There are groups working on making sure that classrooms are safe and orderly for teachers to provide them the support that they need. There are programs to help teachers get more experience before they enter the classroom to help alleviate some of the student debt that they may acquire, and just getting more teachers where they need to be. We have a lot of staff, but we still know that rural areas it's really difficult to find teachers. Urban areas, it's tough to find teachers. Special education, high school math and science. There are lots of areas where we really do need the staff, and unfortunately, they're not to be found. So the more focus on teacher production that can occur, the better. And lastly, wise funding. We saw that state funding has kept up with inflation. We're at least in the last few years, we're higher than we were pre-Act 10. But is it getting it to where it needs to be? Hopefully those discussions occur. Staff size, that's the biggest problem to tackle. Again, there are a few options, which are don't pay teachers well. That's probably not a good plan. There are everlasting referenda, which is also a difficult decision, and there are layoffs, which are really difficult decisions. Local control and local communities can have those conversations, but really those are the only three ways out of adding more and more staff over the past 5 years. School and district mergers. We know that schools, medium-sized districts have closed 1 or 2 schools by now. Some of the bigger districts are closing 3 to 5. Milwaukee will close double digits, I'm sure, soon. but also districts are maybe considering joining their metropolitan area or their county or smaller districts merging to make sure that they don't have so much overhead and that they're maximizing the resources that they do have and limiting redundancy. So that will continue to happen over the next 5 to 10 years for sure. And then making sure that staff get to where they need to be. Again, we know that there are needs. We know that there should be multiple people applying for jobs and not just a single one and accepting them. And so the better that we can make sure that people get to the rural and urban and high need areas, the better Wisconsin will be. So yeah, I think we have some. I think we're going to have some questions for me, but I just want to say, first of all, thanks so much for listening and participating. I'll make sure you can reach out to me by email. You'll definitely get an 8 p.m. email from me responding to your question with a whole bunch of data that you'll have to get to on the weekend. But I look forward to getting to any responses you may have. So thanks so much for your time today. I appreciate it.
Quinton, a question. What do you think people should be asking their school boards as it relates to ESSER funding?
Yeah, absolutely. Districts are definitely in a tough place. Not saying that they haven't faced really difficult challenges over the last 5 years, whether that's financially, academically, or just operationally, just getting things done. It's always really difficult. But I think one thing that's really important is asking whenever any decisions are made, whether that's layoffs, whether that's referenda, whatever it is. I think the tricky thing is basically just ask, what is your staff, total staff, and what is your staff ratio compared to what it was 5 years ago? Obviously, maybe some kids have some additional needs, but the ratios are so out of whack that there are just opportunities to find ways to limit redundancy. And so emailing your superintendent, emailing your school board president saying, hey, as you guys are making decisions, how many staff do you have compared to 5 years ago before the pandemic started? And what is the ratio of staff to the amount of students that we have? Those would be two really important questions to ask.
Are there any main or other takeaways that you can share between rural school districts and urban school districts of what folks in those different areas should be watching for?
Yeah, their old buildings is really is a really difficult challenge. I know a lot of people, debate whether to go to capital referendum or not. These one-time funds, this was a great opportunity, and many did, to fix the roof, to add HVAC, to kind of solve those big picture problems, knowing that the funds were temporary and need to be spent, and having a big chunk of money that you normally don't have. And so, yes, whenever it comes to, hey, if your gym's falling apart, if your classrooms are, not what they need to be, asking if those ESSER funds, or checking our website. If you search IRG ESSER, you'll be able to find your own district and be able to search for yourself to see, hey, did they allocate funding toward construction that they need? So old buildings is definitely one. Secondly, I think curriculum is a big one. If there's a big chance for you to replace your textbooks in rural and urban areas to get a better quality of education for students. And so finding out which curriculum your district purchased, if it was a good decision, a highly rated curriculum, and if they did the necessary background work to make sure that they were making the best decision for kids, that would be another great question to ask, especially in rural and urban districts where we know the achievement is not where it needs to be. Cool. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate everybody joining us. Again, reach out by email, and I'm happy to respond to any questions. And thanks so much. Have a lovely day.